The Capitalist Unconscious, Marx and Lacan, Chapter 3, Part 2, Fetishism Without Perversion. The affinity of Marx and Freud's use of fetishism is grounded in the discontinuity that they both produce in the historical context, in which the notion was initially deployed. The word originates from Portuguese feitiço, and from Latin factitious, which mean artificial, unnatural, fabricated, fake, and imitation. From the very outset, fetishism seems to indicate a problematic dimension of appearance, not subjective misperception of reality, which would still remain in the context of cognition, and in the opposition of truth and error, but objective appearance, which operates beyond this opposition. This is how it is finally used in Marx and Freud, who accomplish the move from the imaginary appearance to the symbolic semblance. However, this move presupposes a fundamental epistemological shift in the framework in which the notion of the fetish was introduced before the critique of political economy and psychoanalysis deployed its critical meaning. It is well known that the notion emerged from the ethnographic and the colonial context in order to designate the difference between the European colonizers and the peoples of the colonized African and American territories. From the critical perspective, the pseudoscientific use of the fetish in colonial ideology provided the paradigmatic example of fetishization. Marcel Mauss famously wrote that the notion of fetishism contains an immense misunderstanding between two cultures, the African and the European, misunderstanding that pinpoints the ideology of progress shared by colonialism, liberalism, and the Enlightenment. The notion addressed notably the differences in religious practices, covering religions of the African and American peoples, and the objects of their adoration. It first described the present difference between the European cultures of progress and the indigenous cultures of colonized territories, but was later extended to describe the originary state of man. In the beginning, there was fetishism. The fetish appears as a border that delimits the rational from the irrational, true religion from superstition. In his book, Du culte des dieux fétiches, Charles de Brosse introduces fetishism in order to describe a religion that precedes polytheism, the zero level of religious belief, where the symbolic dimension of worship is not yet present. De Brosse reduced fetishism to the imaginary relation to the object, where the subject worships the empirical objects directly and does not address any divine abstractions behind them. In other words, worshipped objects do not represent divinities. They are divinities. The symbolic relation of representation considered, absent, the colonial ideology connects fetishism with ignorance regarding the irregular phenomena in nature, a response to an epistemic dilemma, and an attempt to fill in the gap of the positive knowledge of nature. Fetishist belief does not include knowledge and therefore contrasts with the developed symbolic forms of religious belief, which already contain a corpus of knowledge, the highest point being, of course, the religion of revelation, which supposedly follows immediately from divine knowledge, absolute religion. In order to determine the critical break of Marx and Freud's conception of fetishism, the Italian philosopher Alfonso Iacono draws attention to the relation between the observer and the observed. The colonial context used fetishism in order to demonstrate the prehistoric status of the African and the American peoples, the state of quasi-natural man before the fall into history, and its presumably perpetual progress towards the good. Thereby, the colonial ideology introduced a seemingly insurmountable division between the observer and the observed, the man of history and the man of nature, this good but ignorant savage. The colonial discourse places the observer in a metaposition over the observed. Marx and Freud's transformation of fetishism into a critical notion intervenes precisely at this point. Fetishism can become a tool of critique only under the condition that the seemingly unproblematic division of interiority and exteriority be abolished. The operation is now inverted, and fetishism is applied back to those societies from which it was projected on the primitive other. The terrain where the importance of fetishization in the social and the libidinal economy can be observed is now the industrial societies. In The Poverty of Philosophy and in the German Ideology, Marx criticized the division between natural institutions and artificial institutions, between divine laws and human laws. This critique consequently repeats de Brosse's use of fetishism, albeit under the presupposition of the universal validity of the notion, and hence under the abolition of the metaposition that capitalist cultures had assumed. This repetition within the domestic context produced the minimal difference, which transformed fetishism into a critical notion, precisely the axiom that there is no cultural metaposition. As a consequence of this conceptual reinvention, the critique of political economy later demonstrated that there is no possibility of demarcating the language of commodities from the language of political economy. The Prosopopoeia of Commodities, which concludes the chapter on commodity fetishism in Capital, is possible only under the abolition of the fantasy of economic meta-language, the defetishization of economists as subjects of knowledge. When economists speak, they speak the language of commodities, which is conditioned by the very same autonomy of the signifier as human language. They unknowingly remain in the horizon of the fetishist appearance, which now designates more than it did in colonial ideology, not the prehistoric state of ignorance, imaginary illusion, or cognitive error, but an objective misunderstanding generated by the autonomy of exchange. By abolishing the hypothesis of the economic meta-language, fetishism as a critical notion includes the observer in the observed. Marx and Freud do not speak from a meta-position, but assume the double role of critics and subjects of fetishism. Freud repeated the same operation in relation to sexuality, thereby problematizing the established and until then unchallenged division between normal and abnormal sexual goals, of natural sexuality, anchored in the primacy of anatomical difference, and its unnatural, perverted, degenerated image, which aims at partial objects or goals that are antithetical to nature. Far from being the partisan of vulgar phallocentrism, Freud demonstrated that the apparent necessity and univocity of the phallic reference is constantly undermined from within by contingency. The phallus is the privileged semblance which has little, if anything, in common with anatomy. What is most important in Freud's conception of sexuality is not so much that he rejects the opposition of the normal and the pathological, but that he discovers a cut between sexuality and biology, its presumably natural and ultimate normativity, a minimal displacement, which constitutes human sexuality as essentially polymorphous and decentralized. In other words, the pluralism of forms stresses that sexuality is marked by equivocity and inadequacy. By distinguishing sexuality and anatomical sexual difference, it can be safely said that Freud problematized the very notion of nature. To repeat, psychoanalysis turns around the postulate that there is no sexual norm, hence no sexual metaposition, from which the sexual relation could be articulated. The extension of sexuality beyond the anatomical and procreative framework contains the basic psychoanalytic insight that sexuality cannot be traced back to a supposedly natural need, and should instead be recognized as a material consequence of the causality of the signifier. Another important shift concerns the relation between knowledge and fetishism. While the colonial use of fetishism is undoubtedly rooted in the simple opposition between knowledge and ignorance, Marx and Freud introduced a new form of knowledge, which reaches beyond the cognitive framework of the ideological use of fetishism. Knowledge that does not know itself, to repeat Lacan's reformulation of the concept of the unconscious. Even if it would be exaggerated to search for the discovery of the unconscious in Marx, The form of unknown knowledge is at least indicated in his apparently marginal remark, which resumes the fetishist projection. They do not know it, nevertheless they do it. The colonialist ideologues did not know that the knowledge they produced of the primitive other reflected their own relation to commodities, money and capital, or as Iacono writes, the European ideology of the 18th century tried to reduce all the space occupied by contemporary savages to a simple reflection of the past. It imposed its history by presenting it as a universal one. The way in which the Western observer penetrates the universe of the other is thus determined by an idea of history and time, which, by including this universe in its own, simultaneously excludes. The central operation of fetishism is this internally doubled operation of inclusive exclusion and exclusive inclusion, the only place from which it is possible to assume the phantasmatic metaposition. Marx was the first to localize a case of fetishism, commodity fetishism, in its actual cultural environment, and he determined the projection that supports the capitalist social link, the subversion of the relations between men through the relations between things, the fetishization of objects rather than the fetishization of subjects, even if the latter is not abolished in capitalism. Very early on, Lacan noticed the logical value of Marx's critique of fetishism, which enables psychoanalysis to think fetishism without perversion, and to overcome the predominantly biological signification that the notion obtained in Freud. Marx's critique of fetishism anticipates nothing less than the notion of the signifier. To repeat the entire passage in question, if we place the interhuman relation at the root of everything, we finally merely reduce the fact of fetishization of human objects onto some interhuman misunderstanding, which presupposes a reference to meaning as such. In short, it is highly surprising that the doctrine that describes itself as Marxist argues for the thesis that takes human subjectivity as its first given, but not human praxis. Contrary to this, it seems to me that we merely need to open the first volume of Capital in order to become aware of the fact that Marx's first step in the analysis of the fetish character of the commodity consists in the fact that he approaches the problem on the level of the signifier as such, even if the term is not pronounced. The relations between values are given first as relations between signifiers, and the entire subjectivity in the concrete case of the subjectivity of fetishization is inscribed in this dialectic of the signifier. There is absolutely no doubt about this. Marx's anticipation of the signifier consequently implies a more radical theory of the subject from the later Marxist hypostasis of class consciousness, which is presumably embedded in a historical process of overcoming alienation. According to Michael Heinrich, the history of Marxism is marked by two false conclusions: the conclusion from class position to class consciousness, and further from class consciousness to its a priori revolutionary character. The conclusion concerning the revolutionary character of the proletariat is not erroneous in itself, since the correct placing of the proletariat as the privileged social embodiment of the structural contradictions of capitalism already disturbs the established fetishist appearance and opens up the minimal space for political organization and revolutionary politics. What is problematic in this conclusion is that Marxism, in its worldview tendency, deduces the revolutionary character from a quasi-positivist epistemology and a false theory of the subject, which make this subversive potential seem strictly univocal, a matter of positive knowledge or consciousness. This univocity consequently reintroduces the teleological understanding of history that the mature Marx abolished in favor of a more radical conception of alienation, necessitated by nothing other than the autonomy of value. Both conclusions that Heinrich criticizes in worldview Marxism draw from the pre-critical Marx, for whom alienation still signifies a reflexive and presumably reversible relation, alienation of the generic human essence that precedes it, while for the critical Marx, alienation signifies the production of subjectivity that is irreducible and heterogeneous to consciousness. Marx's trajectory from idealist humanism to historical materialism reveals that alienation could be attributed a positive meaning. Being inseparable from structure, it no longer stands for the loss of some originary fullness in being, but for a productive process endowed with a transformative potential. Freud made the same point in his minimalist epistemological discussion of the revolutionary sciences, physics, biology, psychoanalysis. In its decentralizing effects, the modern scientific revolution is a form of alienation which suspends the domination of human narcissism in pre-modern forms of knowledge. The epistemological and political triumph of capitalism, however, consists in the fact that it succeeded in healing the narcissistic wounds while also introducing a new form of alienation, commodity form, that no less draws from scientific sources. The same mistake as in the Marxist fetishization of the laborer can be repeated in the fetishization of the capitalist by reducing the existing form of exploitation to the supposedly conscious knowledge of the capitalist class. In contradistinction to such a simplification, Marx repeatedly insisted that the capitalist is more than man, with bad intentions. He is the personification of capital. The fetishization of the capitalist nevertheless persists and stands at the very core of the modern power relations. Now it is extraordinary that ever since there have been economists, nobody up till now has ever made this remark that wealth is the property of the wealthy. The wealthy have property. They buy everything. In short, well, they buy a lot. But I would like you to meditate on this fact, which is that they do not pay for it. And why does one let oneself be bought by the wealthy? Because what they give you stems from their essence of wealth. Buy from the wealthy, from a developed nation, you believe, and this is what the meaning of the wealth of nations is, that you are simply going to share in the level of a rich nation. Lacan's seemingly superficial remark targets one of the central and most persistent illusions that the advocates of neoliberalism and the ideology of progress incessantly repeat, that in some undetermined future all social differences and antagonisms will be abolished, and a stable and full-functioning social relation will emerge from the present social inequalities. Behind this fairy tale scenario, the actually existing power relations are reproduced, which makes of progress the central hypothesis of the modern master. The rich buy everything, or more generally, the only goal of capital is to valorize itself. This structural tendency generates the fetishist appearance of self-engendering value, which causes the desire for participation in the presupposed essence of wealth. In order for this obscenity of capitalism to be socially implemented with success, it must be accompanied by an ideological fiction, precisely the idea of a permanent and unstoppable progress with no foundations whatsoever in economic, political, or logical reality, but which the self-proclaimed economic experts persistently substantiate with statistical data, economic mathematics, and political reforms throughout history. Behind all the appearance of democratic change and progress in equality, wealth remains the property of the wealthy, despite all the efforts other nations make to establish a participatory relation to it. The more the wealthy buy everything, the more they are fetishized, and the deeper the gap between the rich and the poor, from which capitalism successfully extracts surplus value. What really works in both meanings of the word, and is the privileged source of wealth in capitalism, is the structural non-relation. No other system in history was more successful in turning social inequalities and structural contradictions into the privileged source of value, of course under the condition that this exploitation of non-relation is covered with the familiar layers of appearances, abstract notions of freedom and equality. The fetishization of the wealthy is linked to the repetition of the act of buying, through which the capitalist became the modern master. But because this buying occurs under the tendency to self-valorization, it contains the already mentioned renunciation of jouissance. What matters is the repetition of the act, which persists beyond what others project on the capitalist, and which generates his supposed essence. Why is it that once he has become rich, he can buy everything without paying for it? because he will have nothing to do with jouissance. That is not what he repeats. He repeats his purchase. He buys everything again, or rather, whatever turns up, he buys. The essence of the capitalist is not in some hidden treasure, a gelma, nor in some presupposed knowledge of the relations that constitute the market, but in the senseless repetition of buying, through which he appropriates the surplus product contained in every produced commodity, surplus labor. The social imposition of generalized indebtedness is clearly not excluded from this picture. It is its hidden support and flip side. Lacan exposes the nature of fetishization by making a play on words with property. The fetishist mistake derives from the fact that it treats wealth as intrinsic to private property, which in the given case serves as the visibility and the empirical demonstration of wealth as a property of the wealthy. One buys from the wealthy, or one allows oneself to be bought by them, because one believes that by being turned into their private property, one will become consubstantial with their essence of wealth. One believes in the continuity between the visible and the invisible wealth, that behind the immense collection of commodities the wealthy appropriate there is a deeper essence of wealth. In doing so, one believes that the wealth is transmissible, contagious, that the economic relations with a wealthy nation will give access to their secret. In this process, those who are bought obtain precisely the opposite. They end up with pure loss. However, in the process, what you lose is your knowledge, which gave you your status. The wealthy acquire this knowledge on top of everything else. It's simply that, precisely, they don't pay for it. The truth of fetishization is revealed in the transference of knowledge in the most literal sense of the term. The fetishized subject, in the given case a wealthy nation, is supposed to possess knowledge that supports the production of wealth. An entire segment of classical political economy is dedicated precisely to this question. What knowledge supports the economic growth? The introduction of Homo economicus, whose presupposed knowledge of the laws of the market is associated with the no less presupposed knowledge of its private interests, most firmly places the economic debate on the epistemic terrain. But the truth of fetishization is that the transference pushes the subject into domination and inequality, e.g., economic dependency on a wealthy nation, just as the selling and buying of labor power goes hand in hand with the dependency of labor on capital. The poorer nation thereby becomes the passive recipient of economic and political dictates. The loss of knowledge through its projection in the wealthy other, which is supposed to know for the subject, summarizes this dependency and immediately turns out to be logically equivalent to the loss of value in the labor process. When the wealthy nation buys everything in line, in the end this buying never remains limited to commodities, but always comprises the infrastructure, banks, enterprises, and so on, until the wealthy nation ends up determining the economic system of an entire country. It gains knowledge, the means of production, and surplus value, the object of production, free of charge. It is true that the apparently evident and banal conclusion, according to which wealth is a property of the wealthy, and not, for instance, a positive quality of some abstract economic subjects, never occurred to political economy. The reason for this is evidently in the fact that political economy never thought of associating the source of wealth with the inexistence of social relation, and with the social inequalities that make this inexistence manifest. However, this association did occur to Marx, who also described the specific type of reflection that makes this property appear as a generic essence, while also liberating the creative potential of structural contradictions. The mysterious character of the commodity form consists, therefore, simply in the fact that the commodity reflects the social character of labor as objective characteristics of men's own labor, as the objective characteristics of the products of labor themselves, as the socio-natural properties of these things. Hence, it also reflects the social relation of the producers, to the sum total of labor as an externally existing relation between objects. With this quid pro quo, the products of labor become commodities, sensual, suprasensual, or social things. What matters here is the inversion that the seemingly innocent and banal act of exchange, quid pro quo, transforms the products of labor, the empirical objects or use values, into commodities, exchange values, defined as sensual, suprasensual things. This last description is of central importance because it questions the simple distinction of the sensual and the suprasensual, the material object of labor and the immaterial system of differences and social relations. The critical materialist orientation uncovers their overlapping equivocity and indistinctness, the intrusion of one realm into another, which questions the very idea of materiality. The order of predicates is crucial here. Marx does not speak of the suprasensual character of the sensual, because this would suggest that the sensual contains a more true suprasensual aspect, a hidden agalma, the valuable kernel behind the banal empirical shell. This is, according to Marx, the standpoint of classical political economists, for whom value, the suprasensual, is a positive quality of sensual commodities. Such placement makes wealth appear as an immense collection of commodities, the appearance that introduces the first volume of capital and is immediately rejected, but not as a property of the wealthy, where an essential inequality in structural non-relation would enter the picture. From the viewpoint of commodity fetishism, all commodities appear as suprasensual sensual, empiric objects endowed with an occult power to engender value. This suprasensual character of the sensual intensifies in the developed forms of capitalist abstractions, general equivalence, and fictitious capital. Of course, Marx's move consists in showing that the actual efficiency of these objects becomes evident only after the perspective has been turned around and the formal determination of the subjective attitude to commodities, money, and capital has been accounted for. Fetishism remains caught in a religious standpoint, suprasensual sensual, while the critical materialist turn assumes a logical position, sensual suprasensual. Only as sensual suprasensual objects can commodity. Only as sensual suprasensual objects can commodities be said to be social or discursive, and not metaphysical, objects which support the isolation of the actual subject of value. Again, from the viewpoint of fetishism, the subject of value is value itself, a vital subject, which accounts for the apparently automatic and autonomous increase of value. From the viewpoint of critique, the subject of value is a rejected negativity, which remains heterogeneous to the apparent vitalism of values. The move from the suprasensual sensual to the sensual suprasensual contains a shift in the conception of materiality. The fetishization of commodities reveals behind the apparent political economic materialism a deeply rooted idealism, and even spiritualism, because it treats value as causa sui and capitalist abstractions as living forces. To this spiritualized materialism, Marx opposes the materiality, sensuality of structural and logical relations, suprasensual. It is not objects but structures that are autonomous and hence endowed with causality. In order to rigorously determine the materiality in question, Marx first rejects the possibility of reading the sensual suprasensual through the physiological metaphor of perception, e.g., seeing the unseeable. This would not amount to a materialist critique of objective appearance. In the same way, the impression made by a thing on the optic nerve is perceived not as a subjective excitation of the optic nerve, but as the objective form of a thing outside the eye. In the act of seeing, of course, light is really transmitted from one thing, the external object, to another thing, the eye. It is a physical relation between physical things. As against this, the commodity form and the value relation of the products of labor within which it appears have absolutely no connection with the physical nature of the commodity and the thingly relations arising out of this. It is nothing but the definite social relation between men themselves, which assumes here, for them, the fantastic form of a relation between things. In order, therefore, to find an analogy, we must take flight into the misty realm of the religious world. The mirror reflection oversimplifies the torsion between the commodity form, because it still points towards a symmetrical relation. The secret of commodity form comes down to the minimal shift in reflection, which seemingly departs from a symmetry between object relations and human relations, but actually contains an additional distortion. The imaginary mirror reflection is internally broken because it contains a symbolic abstraction, quid pro quo, exchange value or signifier, which are both cases of non-identity. Value is nothing but a relation to another value, and signifier a relation to another signifier. Consequently, the commodity is non-identical as well. This non-identity manifests in its double character, use value and exchange value, and comprises two relations: the sensual relation of commodity to human need, and the supersensual relation of commodity to another commodity. The social link seems to be constituted on the second level, but it does not leave the first one outside. To recall again Marx's point from the Grundrisse, the production of commodities is the production of needs. There is no unproblematic relation to commodities. Marx's entry into the logic of the signifier consists in his definition of fetishism, the inversion of relations between men and the relations between things. This inversion presupposes the shift from the imaginary to the symbolic, the primacy of the abstract, but no less material act of exchange, that the above passage addresses through the shift from the physiological metaphor of vision to the misty realms of religion. That the imaginary reflection contains an additional deformation, a symbolic torsion within the imaginary reflection, which can be accounted for only through the autonomy of value, quid pro quo, did not go unnoticed in Iacono's discussion of fetishism. There are two moments in the inversion. The first moment concerns the process of restitution of the image of social characters of human labor. The second moment concerns the fact that this restituted image is modified in relation to the reality that it reflects. It is very important to mark the distinction between both moments, in order to avoid the simplification and misunderstanding, which very often make the inversion simply coincide with alienation. Marx's comparison very clearly stresses the necessity of distinguishing between constituted alienation, which signifies an imaginary projection exemplified by the model of vision and by the projection of human essence in God, and constitutive alienation, which comes down to the non-identity of value and signifier. This does not mean that Marx simply equates the relations between things and the relations between men, since such a move would again imply a reflexive turn. Marx claims that in order to think the connection between the production of value and the social non-relation, we first must reject the idea that the relation between conscious individuals is exported into the kingdom of objects. Instead, he insists that behind the constituted alienation, where social relations assume the phantasmatic form of relations between commodities, there is a more fundamental constitutive alienation, which distorts every immediate relation between men. In the end, commodity fetishism is the immediate capitalist form of social relation. In feudalism, fetishization would assume a different form, for instance, the fetishization of the king's body. A materialist reading of alienation moves not from the religious metaphysical sphere to its anthropological empirical background. In this respect, Freud's reduction of religion to obsessive neurosis and the explanation of divinities as projections of human desires echoes Feuerbach rather than Marx, but from the foreground of human and commodity relations to the misty realms of religion. Why do religious abstractions explain constitutive alienation? What in religion allows us to think alienation as a productive process resulting in a specific form of subjectivity? Precisely the recognition of the autonomy of these abstractions. There, the products of the human brain appear as independent figures endowed with a life of their own, which enter into relations both with each other, or with each another, and with the human race. The statement is ambiguous because Marx again refers to the dialectical appearance, which always includes an illusory dimension. The religious mistake consists in the false understanding of the autonomy in question. It conceives it in terms of positive entities, objects, and not in terms of logical relations. Abstract silhouettes, Gestalten, are not spectralities that would need to be brought down to a solid ground of human reason. Marx is neither a humanist reductionist, empirical materialist, nor an exorcist or ghost buster, speculative idealist. His critique of political economy is a hauntology, an attempt to isolate the logic that generates the fetishist appearance, where the logical autonomy of value assumes the form of objects and positive qualities. This critical and materialist move is in perfect accordance with the way modern science treats natural appearances. Unlike empirical materialism, which remains centered on immediate sensuality and consciousness, religion takes the autonomy of value, hence the autonomy of logical relations, seriously, thereby offering an essential dialectical materialist lesson. According to Marx, religious abstractions and commodities should be thought in a homological way. So it is in the world of commodities with the products of men's hands. In the capitalist universe, we are dealing with the same logical autonomy and with the same mystification of this autonomy. As exchange values, commodities become more than mere human products because they represent a discursive consequence marked by non-identity, labor power, thereby making of labor too a sensual, supersensual process. Commodities thus display the autonomy of value, and in this respect, Marx makes a minimal yet crucial correction of the fetishist theory of value, for which again the same autonomy appears as a positive and objective quality of capitalist abstractions. After having situated the importance of religion, Marx finally introduces the notion of fetishism. I call this the fetishism which attaches itself to the products of labor so soon as they are produced as commodities, and is therefore inseparable from the production of commodities. Production of commodities is production of the fetishist appearance. The fetishist relation is inseparable from the structure of production, and different structures group different fetishizations in different fetishizations, period. In the last instance, fetishization and exploitation are two interdependent components of every hitherto existing social relation. Marx's move from the subjective to the objective appearance points in the direction of what Lacan later called the semblant. In order to show the point of the autonomy of the signifier, Lacan starts from the objective semblance in nature, like reflections on the water surface, rainbows or an animal's protective colors, and so on. This objective semblance remains imaginary and is not to be mistaken with the signifier, which also creates the appearance of imitating reality, communication, the adequate relation between words and things, meaning and univocal relation to the signified. However, the semblance in nature imitates merely through reflection, while the signifier imitates through differentiation. Recall the Hegelian statement that already served the early Lacan and that defines the world as the murder of the thing. This surely does not suggest that the signifier abolishes some presupposed immediate relation to the thing, but that it becomes the privileged mode of its presence. The Hegelian reference, well pointed as it may seem, nevertheless remains in the frame of the signifying function of speech, and of the relation between the signifier and the signified, and does not exhaust the consequences of its absolute autonomy. The emergence of the signifier denaturalizes the semblance in nature by introducing into nature something that its semblances do not possess: difference. The semblance in which the discourse is identical to itself is the semblance in nature. To put it in the most banal way, the semblance in nature does not point to another semblance, but to another thing. It deceives through the imitation of an empirical quality. In this imitation, it remains identical with itself, and so its autonomy and objectivity are merely apparent. In relation to this multiplicity of natural semblances, the signifier turns out to be semblance as such, the semblance, which subordinates and transforms all natural semblances. These now become, for the speaking being, indistinguishable from the semblance. Unlike natural semblance, the discursive semblance is pure difference, S1, the master signifier, which signifies the non-identity of every signifier with itself. In relation to the denaturation of the semblance, which follows from the intervention of the signifier, Lacan even speaks of the accumulation of the signifiers. Primitive accumulation that concerns the emergence of language, the birth of the master signifier, through which the things are murdered, and the semblances in nature are transformed into signifiers. The natural reflections become the prose of the world and the language of things that Foucault accentuates in the theory of signs, through which the Renaissance rediscovered Plato's linguistic myth. The second example, which could illustrate the transformation of natural semblances, even if only in a limited range, is Galileo's metaphor of the book of nature written in geometrical language. According to Galileo, the mathematical signifier is already operative in nature, in the movement of astronomical bodies, this paradigmatic case of natural semblance, which seduced ancient and medieval science to geocentrism and the spherical conception of the universe. In opposition to this quest for the continuity between the natural and the discursive semblance, between semblances and semblance, identity and difference, Lacan marks the discontinuity that the primitive accumulation introduces into the semblance, a process that progressively gives birth to the autonomy of difference. This systematic break, which in the end reveals that nature as such is an immense collection of semblances. The aim of Lacan's hypothesis of the primitive accumulation of semblances is to show that the signifier introduces a constitutive alienation, which contains a break with alienation in nature, in the sense of mirror reflection, and is also irreducible to the capitalist forms of alienation. Returning at this point to Marx, if his critique of fetishism would not move from the physiology of vision to the materialist lessons of religion, the inversion would simply repeat his pre-critical and humanist reading of alienation, and thereby overlook the break between alienation as an imaginary reflection and alienation as a structural operation. The point is to show that human relations exist in the way in which they are distorted. There are no human relations without distortion. However, the metaphor of the mirror is not necessarily limited to the reflexive model of alienation. In this regard, the notion of the mirror stage that Lacan introduced in his early work is as essential for highlighting the constitutive character of alienation as his later notion of the signifier. The mirror stage, this originary drama that gives birth to the human ego through the child's recognition in the mirror image, already contains a split. The recognition of the external image is not so much the recognition of its identity with the inner stream of consciousness, but moreover the first objective encounter of the split that separates me from myself through my own image. The recognition of identity always already contains a recognition of difference, the identity of the identity and difference, to put it in Hegelian language. The imaginary contains a constitutive alienation, the production of the split ego, and a constituted alienation, the production of the asymmetrical relation between the subject and the other. The unity of the ego is established through the encounter of the externality of my own image, the projection of the bodily surface, which stands opposite to my gaze as an enclosed totality. However, this constitution of the ego excludes the split from which this projection was possible in the first place. When Iacono writes that the reconstructed image remains within deformation, this means that the inversion of reflection, the attempt to read the reflection backwards, is already productive. It gives birth to the fantasy of unity and identity, immediacy and authenticity. To repeat, the reconstruction of the alienated entity produces a new fetishization, which should be traced back to the structural relations that produced it.